Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020, and this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on. So I don't have a guest today. We're going to talk about current events, and I got to start with Gaza because, I talked about it 2 weeks ago, but the genocide by starvation now, as well as bombing, continues. And the international community is at best, urging Israel to open the border, but not doing much about it. The UN Special Rapporteur on this conflict, Francesca Albanese, said on X Thursday, quote, "States must break the blockade and send navies with aid and stop the genocide. History will not forget." So she's basically calling for armed intervention. Is this a case where armed intervention is justified? I think so. And actually, the United Nations has done this before, going around the UN Security Council by adopting what is called a Uniting for Peace resolution, which can authorize armed intervention to stop genocide or wars of aggression. The UN did this in 1956. It passed a Uniting for Peace resolution that authorized a United Nations emergency force, a military and peacekeeping operation, to end the Suez Crisis in 1956, which was precipitated when Israel, Britain, and France jointly invaded Egypt to take control of the Suez Canal after Egypt nationalized it. And in this case, the US and the Soviet Union united and overrode the veto by Britain and France in the Security Council to get this Uniting for Peace resolution passed. And once it passed and the peacekeeping forces being assembled, Israel, Britain, and France backed off. They stopped their invasion. It worked. In fact, the U.S. still has troops deployed in the UN peacekeeping force on the Egyptian-Israeli border that have been there since 1956. So this could be done. But is this a case where the world's ready to unite for peace? Unfortunately, it doesn't look like it. I don't see any world leaders seconding what Francesca Albanese said last week. We'll put the tweet in the chat, so you can see what she said. The world is standing by, and the world gives lip service to the idea of never again after the Holocaust. Never again is the world going to stand by when we see something like Hitler's industrialized genocide of European Jews. And at that time, the world knew what was going on, but it didn't prioritize it in the war to defeat Hitler. They, worked on their fronts, but didn't disrupt what was going on at the concentration camps and the rail lines leading to them and so forth. The world knew even earlier about the Holodomor, where Stalin starved an estimated 7 million peasants in Ukraine, the Northern Caucasus region of Kuban and Kazakhstan in 1932 and 33. And instead they let, what was his name? Walter, I forget his name. There was a New York Times reporter that was just covering it up and, is a journalist who lives in infamy. The post-World War order that the U.S. helped set up was supposed to be based on international law to prevent genocide and stop wars of aggression. But today, when Israel and Russia and other countries are allowed to break international law without international consequences, genocides get carried out. And I want to say something about Sudan. In terms of scale, it's even worse than Gaza. The estimated 150,000 deaths from starvation so far, and like 1 million people are on the edge of starving to death. And this is called a civil war, but it's really more a proxy war with many foreign powers engaged. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia, in this case on the same side, are supporting the Sudanese armed forces. And the UAE, Turkey, Ethiopia, Iran, Chad, and Libya are supporting the rapid support forces. And it's hard to call this a civil war. This is a fight between different factions of the armed forces of Sudan for power. And the world, instead of providing food, is providing weapons. And, their interests are gaining access to Sudan's oil, its ports, and other resources. And, this is a very complex civil and proxy war, if you want to call it partly a civil war. I mean, the civil war is really the crushing of the revolution that the Sudanese had in 2018 to try to, they got rid of the Islamist leader at the time, and they were hoping for a civilian democratic dispensation, and ended up with a compromise with the armed forces, who then broke their end of the deal. So there was another war, at least a conflict, between a popular revolution and the armed forces. But the international community is just watching. The World Food Program, wants to provide food. It's underfunded, particularly because the U.S., which has been providing about half of its budget, has cut off all U.S. funds during the Trump administration. So the least we can demand is that the World Food Program get funded and these people get fed. One of the things that has struck me really hard when, I've been working with Ukrainian leftists over the last few years, is how much they're focused on the necessity of strengthening international law, and how much they were hoping that the Western left would lead the way in reforming the UN and other international institutions to prevent wars of aggression and genocide. And one of them who wrote a lot about this is Taras Bilis, who's a Ukrainian leftist and now soldier who is currently recovering from shrapnel wounds. He won the Daniel Singer Prize in 2024 for the Best Socialist Essay of the Year, and it was about this subject of strengthening international law. I spoke with him when I was in Kyiv, and it was right after Trump got elected, and he was distraught, frankly. He had hoped the Western left would get its act together and lead the reformation of international law and institutions in a few years, precipitated by the obviously aggressive war of Russia against Ukraine. But after Trump's election, he said to me he was afraid now it would take decades at best. He saw Trump's victory as a victory for Putin and the global far right. And I hope, our task is to prove Taras's pessimism wrong. And speaking of the global far right, let's go to Ukraine, where yesterday we saw this disgusting love fest between two of the key leaders of, fascism in the world, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. If the U.S. adhered to international law, Putin would have been arrested when he got to Alaska and sent to The Hague, because he has an arrest warrant out for him from the International Criminal Court for kidnapping thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia. And, Putin has been restricted. Remember, he couldn't go to the 2023 BRICS summit in South Africa because South Africa said, we're a signatory to the Rome Statute that set up the International Criminal Court, and if you come here, we're going to have to arrest you. So Trump had to go by video conference. And here we are rolling out a red carpet for this war criminal. We ended his diplomatic isolation, at least from the Western democracies. And he went home without agreeing to the ceasefire that Trump said he wanted, and pushed down the road possible sanctions and the severe consequences that Trump promised just a few days ago if Putin did not agree to a ceasefire. And this morning, Trump has added that he now supports not a ceasefire, but a comprehensive peace deal, which is Putin's position. And that gives Putin the go-ahead to continue the war, drag out the negotiations. And so what we got is, out of this meeting yesterday, Russia's war of aggression will go on. There'll be no sanctions, as Trump made crystal clear when he spoke to Hannity right after the meeting. he said as he left that press briefing, it wasn't a press conference because they didn't let the press ask questions. He said he was going to call Zelensky right away. No, he went to an interview with Sean Hannity of Fox News and called Zelensky and other European leaders on the, his Air Force One flight back to Washington. So Trump was taco again. Trump always chickens out. TACO, taco. Putin got recognition, no ceasefire, no sanctions. And Trump called that progress, but no deal yet. And, what we really know, or seem to know, because they didn't really spell it out, is that the deal that they're coming close to, that both Putin and Trump indicated, was that the plan is to tell Zelensky, you've got to give up the land of 4 oblasts, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, that Russia's partially conquered. They've got to give all of that up to get a peace deal. And of course, Zelensky said, no way. Let's put in the link a statement from Gabrielis Landsbergis, who was the, until last year, the foreign minister of Lithuania. And his article is titled "The Shameful Plan to Betray Ukraine, De facto, not de jure." And, the talk we got from Witkoff, Steve Witkoff, the so-called envoy, he's really a golf and real estate buddy of Trump's and doesn't know what the hell he's doing. He said when he talked to Putin, they were talking about a West Bank solution. In other words, de facto, it's controlled by Israel, the West Bank, and Russia, the 4 oblasts. And de jure, it would still be nominally Palestinian land or Ukrainian land. And what Landberger says, it doesn't make any damn difference whether it's de facto or de jure. The oppression of the Ukrainians in the Russian-occupied territories will continue. And I urge you to read that. It's very forcefully worded, and I think makes the point well. And then there was more that was hinted at that they were talking about. They had business leaders from both sides, and they hinted at joint exploration of the Arctic, which means oil and gas, which means a climate bomb by these 2 petrostates. And, the U.S. wants to go back to business as usual with Russia under Trump by, lifting the sanctions and, jointly exploiting the Arctic oil and gas. And, Russia's already doing that. They've deployed one of several planned nuclear power plants on barges floating on the Arctic Sea to power Arctic fossil fuel industry. What the hell could go wrong? It's just unbelievable. The incompetence of the Trump team was shown about how this thing came about, this meeting yesterday. Steve Witkoff, who's met 5 times personally with Putin in Moscow, came back from the last meeting a week ago and reported that Russia was willing to trade the territories it controls in Zaporizhia and Kherson if Ukraine would relinquish its control of the rest of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. And it turns out Witkoff didn't understand what he was being told. He doesn't even know where the names of these oblasts, as he made clear when he came back from one of his meetings with Putin and couldn't repeat them in a Tucker Carlson interview. But that's what got Trump talking in the last week about swapping lands as part of a peace deal. And of course, Russia's position is that Ukraine just withdraw from its own territory that it controls. But Witkoff, realized, and the people around him began to realize that what he thought he heard about land swaps is not what he really heard or what was really said. But it's hard to know what these people are about. The only thing we know is that Witkoff and the Trump team are ignorant, incompetent, and overmatched by the Russians. So, it took a couple of days for Trump to realize that the deal was not, parts of 2 obelisks for parts of two other obelisks. And then Trump had last Friday, a week ago, the threat of sanctions being implemented if Putin didn't agree to a ceasefire. So Putin said, let's have a meeting. And Trump immediately agreed. And that's how we got the meeting this week. So Trump was taco last week, as he was again yesterday. And Zelensky, in the lead up to this, indicated he was willing to make a big concession. He said this on Monday. And he said Ukraine was open to freezing the front lines, leaving Russia in control of 19% of Ukraine that Russia seized militarily, if they got security guarantees from the West to protect the other 81% of Ukraine. And, the Ukrainian people are not going for that. And I think Zelensky knows that. I think he was trying to, protect himself from what he and the Europeans fear, and that is Putin and Trump are getting together to try to force a deal on them. So the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology had a survey recently, and they found 38% of Ukrainians were willing to, freeze at the front lines and give up at least de facto control of that territory for the time being, but 52% were opposed. And that's important to understand because there's a lot of talk now from the pro-Russian side touting a Gallup poll that was published on August 7th. It showed 62% of Ukrainians are for negotiations to end the war. And that's way up from, at the beginning of the war, it was like 22%. And that's compared 62% for negotiations, 39% who want to just keep fighting to get the Russians out. But what the Gallup poll doesn't say, and people are implying this, but it's not true, is that the Ukrainians who want negotiations are willing to stop resisting Russia's offensive. No, they'll keep fighting. They just want to, talk to Russia about stopping the war. So I think that's important to understand because you'll hear about that Gallup poll. Zelensky said this morning that he had spoken one-on-one with Trump for about an hour and then with other European leaders for about another half hour. And that was Trump calling him from Air Force One on the flight back to Washington. That was after Trump had an interview with Sean Hannity of Fox News, which tells you where his priorities. Axios reports that somebody with direct knowledge of the call said it was not easy, which I take to mean Trump was telling Zelensky that, he and Putin are pushing this land for peace deal that is unacceptable to Zelensky or the Ukrainians. And so Zelensky said he would meet with Trump and Putin, like Trump is now advocating. Now, Putin has opposed such a meeting, saying Zelensky's not a legitimate representative of the Ukraine. And I don't think it's likely that meeting will happen. Zelensky is going to meet with Trump on Monday in Washington. And Zelensky also said that Witkoff, and he said this on the call, told Zelensky and European leaders that Putin had this land for peace deal. And so that's probably why the call was not easy. Let's just think about what land swaps mean. It's a terrible precedent. It normalizes imperialism. It affirms Russia's conquest of Ukrainian territories by armed force. And that gives a green light to other imperialist countries to take land by force. And Trump has already done this twice in his first term. He supported Israel's claim to the Golan Heights, to sovereignty over the Golan Heights, to annexation, and Morocco's claim to Western Sahara, which only the U.S. and Israel, beside Morocco, recognize. So what's next? Israel's annexation and ethnic cleansing of Gaza and the West Bank by force? A Chinese takeover of Taiwan by force? Is Kashmir's fate to be determined by a war between China, India, and Pakistan, who occupy different parts of it? Is this to say the U.S. can take over Panama, Greenland, and even Canada by force? I mean, it's a terrible precedent. And it's worth noting also that Putin, in that press briefing at the end, said, that he still thinks we can't get a settlement until it addresses the root causes of the war, which he's been making clear for a year. And what that means is a rollback of NATO back to the footprint it had when Germany reunited in 1990, and a demilitarized Ukraine, a puppet government in Kyiv, if not outright annexation of all of Ukraine. And of course, Putin knows these demands are unacceptable to Ukraine. So the war is going to go on. And the question is, I think, which side are we on? And we know that the Europeans are, haven't been that really supportive of Ukraine. They're pressing Zelensky to accept a land for peace deal, at least on the current front lines. And, go read that piece by Gabrielis Landsbergis that's in the link in the chat. I think he describes, what that means for the people in the occupied territories and, peace in the world. So that's enough said about Ukraine. We'll see what happens Monday when Zelensky comes to Washington. I hope it's not another case of imperialist bullying by Trump and what's the vice president's name? He went on vacation. I can't remember his name. Vance. But then, the fascism at home continued this week. Probably the most significant thing was Trump try to take over the DC police. And I think that's the first step in militarizing policing to protect authoritarian rule. Reportedly on Trump's list next are New York, Boston, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And this is not about crime as much as about scaring rural and suburban white folks with lurid lies about black crime in the cities. And this is an old right-wing trope. It's about dividing us to rule us. And then we had a report in the Washington Post that a leaked Trump administration memo that they are planning to set up a domestic civil disturbance quick reaction force within the U.S. military that could be called on to quash street protests against the administration. And it would be about 600 National Guard troops, half based in Alabama and half in Arizona, and ready at all times to fly off to any city to crush street demonstrations against Trump policies. So there's another thing to put on our agenda, reversing the militarization of policing in the United States, before the police state becomes normalized. So I'm gonna stop there and take your comments and questions and talk about, what we need to do in this situation. Kevin Sanchez, with the recent shooting at the CDC, any thoughts on how we moved from a fleeting moment of global solidarity in 2020 to the normalization of COVID today and the rewriting of the history of the pandemic by right-wingers and even many liberals? Yeah, we got a problem, I think, with conspiracism, conspiracy-minded thinking. And it's an easy way to explain stuff when you think, there's a cabal of a few bad actors, and if we just get rid of them, everything will be okay, rather than seeing the problems we face as being systemic and requiring systematic change in the system. And the stuff, the people that got behind Kennedy that used to be liberals, I don't think they're liberals or leftists anymore. I call them post-left or post-liberal. They've gone over to the right. And, some of them were anti-scientific, kind of crunchy granola New Agers, and now they're lined up with, Steve Bannon and Naomi, the one that gets confused with Naomi Klein, Naomi Wolf. and people like that. That's kind of the paradigm for this post-left. So I think that's part of the problem. We've got people that they think conspiracies instead of looking at reality, analyzing the power structure, who made the policies, how to change them. They've just got the idea that there's this secretive cabal that's, like the whole nonsense about a pandemic to depopulate the world with COVID vaccines. I think that's how we got there. And so why was that able to happen? I think it's because our popular organizations on the left and just civic organizations generally have been hollowed out. So people are susceptible to stuff they're getting online in isolation. And they're not going to union meetings or local chapters of political parties or civic organizations like PTAs, even Elks Clubs or veterans organizations, where people are talking face to face about these issues and getting smarter because they can, talk it through and share thoughts and criticisms and come to a more rational conclusion. Instead, people are isolated, looking at their phones, getting in their silo, and a lot of these people got into the conspiracy silo. And then you end up with people like this shooter at the CDC who was in one of those, anti-vax silos and thought he'd be doing a good thing by shooting up the CDC. So I think, that's why I think we got there. And the answer is we've got to organize our local Green Party chapters, our unions, or organize a union, get involved in civic organizations in the community, social movement groups. We need those face-to-face meetings. And we also need, and I wish I'd brought this link, maybe I can find it in the course of the discussion. There's a good article that Portside put out about a person who was involved in ACORN and community union organizing in Chicago in the 80s and 90s. And, they, in order to survive, unlike the worker centers, which tend to be dependent on foundation grants, they were membership financed organizations. And in Chicago, this was in low-income communities. People were paying $5 a month back then, which is about $20 a month today. And they had a sustainable organization. And they got a lot done. And they were talking to each other. That's the kind of organizing we got to get back to. Andrew Hager, sorry to go off topic, Howie, but with YT having launched its new AI verification policy this week, even after many people have protested against it, what more do you think we should do? YouTube is YT. So it's age verification policy. Yeah, we talked about that a little last week. I mean, I think the purpose of that policy is to prevent underage people from seeing stuff that's not appropriate for them. So I don't have a problem with that. I think your problem is it wants personal information to be able to verify you. And that is definitely a question of privacy. And as I said last week, we've got to have privacy protections covering the internet and social media and these platforms. Europe has legislation on that. We do not. And I think that's where we need to look so that young people can be protected from things that are not appropriate for them. But we're not giving all our personal information out to these giant tech companies, and God knows what they do with it. Andrew Hager, is what I'm saying about the direction the internet's going on accurate, or am I blowing this out of proportion? Well, I think you're saying there's a privacy issue here, and I think you're right. I don't know if you said people are protesting the uh, age verification. I don't know whether they're protesting the concept of age verification or the privacy issues that come with it, but I'm concerned about the privacy issues. So I think you're talking about a real issue, and we've got to address it. Andrew Hager, let's face it, this was never about the children. This is about censorship and suppression of free speech, net neutrality and privacy. The internet as we knew it is at stake, and net freedom is a must. Well, I agree on net neutrality. Having some regulation as to young people's access to things that may not be appropriate for them, I wouldn't call that censorship and suppression of free speech. Would you want Epstein to have free access to young women on the internet to recruit them for his pedophilia? I mean, I think, there is a legitimate reason to have some restrictions by age. That's not the problem. Net neutrality is definitely a problem in terms of everyone having equal access to the internet and their ability to broadcast on it, have platforms on it, and have people have equal access to their platforms as well as others. And of course, privacy, that's definitely an issue. Andrew Hager, and besides, there are better ways to make sure minors don't look at what they aren't supposed to, and that's good parenting. Yeah, but you're probably younger than me. I remember when I was a kid, what parents told me to do, I could get around. And certainly I could figure out how to do that on my phone, which I didn't have back then, but is around today. So I don't think that's sufficient, just, pleading for good parenting. So y'all are quiet this week. What are your thoughts on green technology and rebuilding railroads? Well, okay. I wish we could talk about that, because right now, with Trump in office, all the limited pro-renewable energy and public transportation initiatives are being defunded. And so we've got to stop that. And then, it's something the Green New Deal, the eco-socialist Green New Deal, the global Green New Deal, that's something the Greens have got to keep pushing. And, aside from the climate crisis, we just had this terrible international conference on regulating plastics. And the oil companies dominated, and they didn't really come out of it with any thing that's going to improve that situation. And these, nanoparticles of plastics are now in our blood. We're inhaling it. It's in our food, and it causes health problems. It gums up our organs. It affects our hormone production. It's causing cancers with certain chemicals that come out of the plastics. It's a huge problem. And the idiots running the world, particularly the right wingers, but the center left is not doing what needs to be done either, or even proposing what needs to be done. It's really, the green parties of the world that are on the leading edge of this. And unfortunately, in our country, we haven't got the foothold they have in other countries, which, brings it back to us. And as I've argued, the way we're going to have influence on national policy is to build a strong base that's electing thousands, not just hundreds, to local office, on that foundation, electing people to state legislatures, and then the House of Representatives. And we get a caucus of Greens in the House, we'll have a platform, we'll be able to push our issues. And I think getting into the debate is half the battle, because our positions, if you poll on positions we take, like universal public health care, Green New Deal, tax the rich. They're super majorities, and we're the only party that stands for those things. So, it's really on us to organize so that we can organize that progressive majority that's out there into an effective political force. And it's not going to be done by little conferences with minor celebrities or, a coalition of tiny groups at the top. We all got to go home and do it in our own communities and build up from there. So we have a real mass base that acts, in a cohesive, coherent way in elections and on the streets. And that's really the task we face. So until we do that, we're not going to be able to advance much on green technology. And the railroads, damn, we are so far behind the rest of the world on that. And, freight rail, to the extent rail still exists, is dominating passenger rail on the tracks we do have. And it's not an issue that, the center left, if you want to call the Democrats that, they're really center right. In Europe, they'd be, to the right of the Christian Democrats in most countries. Buttigieg never talked about rebuilding the rails. It wasn't part of Biden's program. He was about, electrifying automobile transportation, which is not the smart way to go forward. So that's something the Greens really have a monopoly on. There's some progressive Democrats, but when it comes to the, environmental side, they put the Green New Deal more in terms of economic justice, which is fine, but they're bad on the technology. I mean, AOC is pro-nuclear power, and she's the leading voice in the House for a Green New Deal, which has gone nowhere. I mean, that was a non-binding resolution. Pelosi wouldn't put it up for a vote, and now the Republicans are in control. If Hakeem Jeffries comes back in control, he's pro-nuke in New York. He was pro-fracking. I mean, that is what the Democrats offer. That's why we need our own party. And we got to go home and organize it, in our communities. It's not going to be done by my podcast or your tweets. It's got to be done with the people in our neighborhoods. And it's going to take a lot of hard, patient organizing. The Green Garrett. Any advice on finding a balance between keeping up with Trump's chaos and recognizing it is on purpose to obscure and divide resistance? I would say, look, there are groups like Indivisible that are mobilizing large anti-Trump demonstrations, and we should be there. And we should be there with the green banners, the green literature, bringing our own demands. Like they don't talk too much about Palestine, we should. But they're doing that organizing. We don't have to do that. We should be focusing on building our local green parties with an eye to getting in power at the local level first and getting a caucus in our state legislatures and the House of Representatives. I think that's the balance. There's plenty of mobilizations being mobilized, and the Greens should be there and use them as an opportunity to talk to more people and share our point of view on issues. But most of our energy should go into building our local mass-based parties that are focused not just on spreading the word and showing the flag, but on seriously trying to get some power, particularly in the legislative side. We don't want to take executive power when we don't have the legislative majority, because then we end up running the system we started out to oppose. So city councils, state legislatures, and the House of Representatives, I think that's where our focus should be. Vicky Corden, the takeover of Washington, D.C. seems to be a rehearsal to get the country ready to get used to the idea of martial law. Any thoughts? Yeah, that's what I was talking about before. This is the first step. And other cities are on the agenda. And then they have this national unit of the U.S. military. It's going to be based in Alabama and Arizona to go out and crush protests. They call it they they say it's to crush violent riots, but they take protests to be violent riots. And I think it's stupid tactics to go around breaking windows and destroying property, because that just gives the cops an excuse to crack down. But that is not an insurrection. That does not require U.S. military intervention. It requires just regular policing. So, yeah, that Trump, he's looking for an excuse to declare martial law and then really crack down on dissent. So we need to be there at the protests, and we need to be smart. Nonviolence is going to be much more effective than, token violence. You're not going to outshoot the U.S. military, and you're not going to, change the system with broken windows. So, but mass nonviolent action can move the public. We saw that in the civil rights movement. We saw that in the anti-Vietnam War movement. We've seen it in many movements. So I think, that should be how we conduct ourselves, and not give Trump any excuses to, militarize the repression of, free speech and assembly and petitioning to redress your grievances, all those good things in the First Amendment. Scout Trooper 164. Any thoughts on Azov managing to kick the Russian advance in Pokrovsk back, even if briefly? Well, let's talk about Azov for a minute. You're talking about the Azov Brigade, which is a part of the Ukrainian military. It's been depoliticized. It did have right-wing roots back in 2014 when, basically the Azov right-wingers went out and fought the Russian insurgents in Donetsk and Luhansk. And they're incorporated in the National Guard. And, their discipline is with the army. And all the reports I've seen is they're not a right-wing military formation. The Ukrainian military has been clear about depoliticizing units, including left-wing and anarchist units that formed early and after the full-scale invasion. Now, there is an Azov movement, which is political, which is right-wing. It's marginal. I mean, the candidates it supported in 2019, the last elections in Ukraine, their presidential candidate got 1.56% of the vote in the first round, and their parliamentary group got, I think, 2.16%, well below the 5% threshold to get proportional representation in the Rada, their parliament. So, first of all, let's get that straight. So, secondly, they're reputed to be a very effective unit, and it was not Pokrovsk where they intervened. It was maybe, I forget how many miles, 30 miles north, a little bit east, where the Russians made a temporary breakthrough the front lines and moved like 17 kilometers. It's a little over 10 miles very quickly. And the reports are in the last few days that group has been pretty much wiped out or captured. There's another group that's encircled by the Ukrainian forces, and it was Azov and some other elite units that were responsible for that. The pro-Russian people are saying, see, Ukraine's going to lose, therefore they should give up before they lose more and accept, surrender to the Russians. But I think the Ukrainians answered that in what they've done to this, temporary advance. And Pokrovsk, you read it, it's about to fall. I can show you headlines saying the same thing over a year ago. The Russians have been trying to get Pokrovsk since 2014. They've been trying to get all of Donetsk. And since, the Wagner group finally broke through and got Avdiivka and Bakhmut, those are the private military forces that was backed by by the Russian state and then revolted and have been reorganized after the death of Prigozhin, their leader, who looked like he tried a coup. It's not clear what he tried to do. Um, so, they've gone from Bakhmut to Pokrovsk. It's like, I forget the exact number. It's like 20 miles. And it's taken them, 2.5 years to go to the outskirts of Pokrovsk. And they've been there for, since last summer. And they just haven't got through. They got some demolition units, small special forces into the streets of Pokrovsk, but they all got wiped out. So I think, it's Azov and a couple of these other units. There's a Da Vinci unit that had a big part in this, repelling this Russian advance. So my thoughts are the Ukrainians are holding the line pretty much. They're slowly giving ground. They've lost last year it was, I think, 0.69% of Ukrainian land to Russian offensives that cost the Russians over 400,000 casualties. It's just a meat grinder for the Russian side. And so, I think it just shows, man, that the Ukrainians, they got the motivation to fight for their land. And that goes back to the invasion in 2022 when Putin thought they'd take Kyiv in a few days and take control of the country. And the Ukrainians defeated them before there was much Western aid, because the people rose up and they hit them as they were driving down that highway from all sides. And it was a debacle for the Russian advance. They went in there with their parade uniforms, thinking they'd be marching around Kyiv as victors, with the Ukrainians welcoming them. And boy, were they wrong. So, I think the defeat of this salient that popped up, over the last week is a good sign for Ukraine. Vicky Corden. Doug Wilson and some of the pastors are promoting the idea of doing away with the 19th Amendment. Any thoughts? That's women's right to vote, the 19th Amendment. It just shows we got some real right-wing nuts. And J.D. Vance, apparently Doug Wilson is his spiritual leader. Don't underestimate how, far right the people running this country are. And it's not popular with the masses. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think if the far right keeps promoting that openly, it's only going to hurt, not even the MAGA movement. Most of them want this. So I think we should just ridicule, J.D. Vance in particular for, being buddy with this pastor. Scout Trooper 164, any disgusting thoughts of folks like Trump wanting to substitute PBS with PragerU? It's effing gross what the conservatives' propaganda is being given. What conservative propaganda is being given. Yeah, I mean, the news today is Trump wants to get rid of all the quote-unquote race-centered stuff in the Smithsonian museums, which means everything about Black people, American Indians, Latinos. Just tell us about the white folks. It's pretty blatant and it's pretty disgusting. And we just got to keep, speaking the truth about our history, and use it as a chance to embrace, multicultural democracy and mutual support rather than dividing, whites against the rest of the people, which is what Trump is really doing. It's his, he reportedly reads Mein Kampf for bed. At least that's what his first wife at bedtime, at least that's what or he reads Hitler. That's what his first wife has said. I don't know if that's true. I'm questioning it because he doesn't read much, but oh man, they're really far to the right and mean spirited toward everybody that doesn't agree with them or doesn't look like them. It's amazing that these guys are in power. I mean, that's what my long article in New Politics at the beginning of the year was about. How did a progressive-minded public majority elect this right-wing nut? At war with us, the Democratic Socialists of America held a convention in Chicago this month. It was last weekend, actually. That's been favorably reported on by Mother Jones, Jacobin, Rolling Stone. Does the level of interest give you hope? Yeah, I would say on balance, yes. What's, I don't know, frustrating is that they talk about a workers' party independent of the Democrats eventually, but the logic of what they're doing and the energy is going into supporting Democratic candidates. So they are in coalition with, the world's second most enthusiastic capitalist party in history, as Kevin Phillips called them a long time ago. And, that basically hides, it basically provides a progressive veneer, even a socialist veneer, to the Democratic Party, which is a neoliberal corporate party. And I've been reading some reports. I'm not through all that I've come my way. But the general impression I get is that they adopted a resolution, I believe, that calls for running a socialist in the Democratic primaries for president, which I think is a dumbass idea. They should be electing independent socialists lower down the ballot and building a stronger base. I mean, there's a lot to be said. In New York City, they reportedly now have 10,500 dues-paying members. They were the core of the Mamdani campaign. They mobilized 50,000 volunteers to canvass knock 1.5 million doors. That's impressive. That's the kind of mass party we need to be building. So I think there's a lot to learn from the organizing and, of course, the messaging. I've talked about this. I think Mamdani's messaging is good. He ran on concrete demands that people could grasp, not abstract ideas. A rent freeze, people understand that, rather than affordable housing, which is, okay, well, what do you mean? And, concrete demands, not socialism. He didn't run on that. He didn't hide from it, but he didn't run on it. And people voted for the concrete demands. I think that's something we can learn from it. I think one debate that hasn't got a lot of attention, and I might have read one of the Jacobin reports. I haven't read the other two. I've read reports from people who were there, not just journalists, but members. One controversial resolution was on international politics and how DSA should relate to international conflicts. And the resolution was a campus resolution. It had 43% vote against it, so it's good there's a debate there. The DSA International Committee pushed that, and they have been, they condemn Russia's invasion, but they withhold solidarity in the form of material aid, including weapons to Ukraine. And they have a campus line, not a class line. In other words, they're looking at it in terms of geopolitics, not class politics and what the working class of Ukraine wants. And they're the ones fighting the Russian invasion. And I think it's not just DSA, it's in the Greens, it's on other parts of the left, that people look at these conflicts in terms of how it impacts, U.S. imperialism, what some of them in the campus camp think is anti-imperialist Russia or Iran or, basically any state that's in conflict with the U.S. And in that campus view, the working class doesn't exist. And social change doesn't come from popular working class action, but from the action of states like Iran, until recently Syria, Russia, China, which are repressive states. And that, Vijay Prashad gave a talk, one of the first demonstrations against U.S. arms to Ukraine. And he was talking about the geopolitics of Eurasia and how, Europe's natural alignment is with Russia and a Eurasian bloc, which is the whole, Putinist and Duginist ideology. And so he's talking geopolitics, not class politics, but he keeps inserting in his talk the slogan, no war but class war, which was totally out of place. He was not talking about class war. He was talking about interstate war. So there's a problem on the left. And I think I'm encouraged that at least 43% voted against the International Committee's resolution, which I read and is not that hardcore anti-Ukraine, but it's still problematic. It's not in solidarity. It's kind of a plague on both your houses, which doesn't help the working class in Ukraine that's being invaded. Vicky Corden, what about the possibility that SCOTUS could overturn same-sex marriage? They want to reverse rights for a lot of people and go back to the Middle Ages. Yeah, it's not even back to the Middle Ages. It's back to the 50s. With same-sex marriage, it's back to the 90s when, or even early 2000s when Barack Obama was still evolving on this question. So, but it's going backwards, no doubt. And if SCOTUS overturns it, that means Congress has got to pass a law to legalize it. I mean, it got legalized by a previous Supreme Court decision, not legislation in the House and Senate. So, that's what we'll have to do. Like we'll have to get Roe v. Wade codified, which the Democrats had a chance to do when they had majorities in both houses under Obama and Biden and didn't. Which again says why we need the Greens out there at least to basically say to the Democrats, if you don't start doing these things, people are going to vote for us because we're for them. And a lot of people are with us on those questions. So, yeah, we'll see what SCOTUS does. But I think we have good reason to believe that they will overturn the precedent and, make same-sex marriage not legalized by the federal government. And, these so-called strict constructionists, I wouldn't put them past them to say it's illegal, even if your state has said it is legal. There's another stronghold of the far right, the Supreme Court. Any thoughts, Andrew Hager, any thoughts on Obama's comeback speech against Trump? I didn't hear a comeback speech. I heard he called Ma'am Danny to give him advice on how to govern. I guess he did speak out a little bit about Trump, but I didn't. I vaguely remember a headline. I didn't read the speech. I don't know what he really said, so I really don't have many thoughts on that. I'll tell you this, I'm not looking to Obama for guidance. The guy was neoliberal, militarist, and just taking Ukraine. In that interview he did with The Atlantic that Jeffrey Goldberg had, he called the interview the Obama Doctrine. The Obama Doctrine was Putin can have Ukraine. It's not in our sphere of influence. It's in his. And, so Obama just kind of shrugged his shoulders when Putin seized Crimea, which sets a terrible precedent, as I talked about at the top. So does that mean it's okay for the U.S. to seize Greenland or Israel to annex the West Bank or China to take over Taiwan? Okay, we're out of time. I saw one more question near the bottom from Scout Trooper. I think I'm going to take a minute to answer. Any thoughts on Beto saying F the rules and Newsom channeling Trump's way of tweeting to combat him? Feels good to use that energy of fire with fire instead of just taking the blows. Yeah, I appreciate Beto's spirit. I don't agree if he's actually saying F the rules. What I miss in all the discussion, in at least the mainstream media, except one discussion I heard with Jamie Raskin, which might have been on Democracy Now!, might have been on MSNBC, but he did say, we need to go to proportional representation. And then the district lines don't matter very much because everybody will get their fair share of representation. That's what I think the Greens should be advocating, that instead of, gerrymandering wars, which are obviously, anti-democratic, we should be pushing the democratic solution, which is proportional representation. Okay, well, I appreciate people being here. There's a lot going on. I don't have a guest scheduled next week. We'll see if maybe I will get one. I've got some people in mind, but I don't have anybody yet. But of course, there's lots to talk about in the news, so we can do a question and answer and comments podcast. And I've been asked to have over 2 weeks a modern monetary theorist, and then the next week a greenbacker who promotes the Green Party platform position on monetary reform. They are having a debate that will be between them in October sometime. And, I should have asked this up front. Maybe next week I'll ask it early. And you can say in the chat whether you'd like to have that debate on this podcast. It's kind of esoteric if you're not into the money question, but it is an important issue. So that may be something coming up. Otherwise, stay active. It makes a difference. And we'll see you next week. Same time, same place. 3:00 Eastern Time live, or you can pick us up on the podcast or on the YouTube, recording. So have a great week.